The story of the new Richmond tornado begins like so many great American tragedies on a day that started out as perfectly ordinary. Tuesday, June 12, 1899. The town of New Richmond, Wisconsin was a thriving community of about 2,000 people nestled in the rolling hills of the St. Croix Valley. It was a railroad town, proud of its brick buildings, its bustling Main Street, and its sense of progress. The Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha Railway ran right through the heart of the town, bringing passengers and freight, connecting this small piece of the Midwest to the rest of the country. In the morning, the sun rose warm and bright over the neat rows of houses and the tall church steeples. Children played in the yards, merchants swept the wooden sidewalks in front of their stores, and farmers in from the country sold their produce at the market. There was no hint of the horror that was gathering just over the horizon. By midday, the air had grown heavy and still, the kind of stillness that makes a man look up from his work and wipe his brow. The heat settled over the town like a blanket. People commented on it as they always do. They said it felt like a storm was brewing. But in late spring in the upper Midwest, storms were as common as dandelions. Nobody paid it much mind. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky began to change. To the southwest, a great bank of clouds rolled in, dark and bruised, climbing higher and higher into the atmosphere. The wind picked up, gusting in erratic bursts, and then died away again. The birds stopped singing. The dogs began to whine. A low, steady rumble came from the distance, not like thunder, but like a freight train moving on a track that seemed to lead straight toward Main Street. The citizens of New Richmond had seen storms before, but they had never seen anything like what was coming. The tornado that would hit them that afternoon is now considered one of the deadliest in Wisconsin history. It was an F5, the most violent category on the modern scale, though back then they had no such names for it. They called it a cyclone. It traveled a path of destruction nearly 40 miles long, but it was the final 10 miles, the ones that passed directly through the heart of New Richmond, that were the most devastating. The storm struck without mercy, without warning, and it changed the town forever. To understand what happened, you have to picture the town as it was at that moment. It was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The streets were full of people going about their business. The train station was busy with passengers waiting for the next departure. The opera house was preparing for an evening show. Children were running home from school, their feet kicking up dust from the dirt roads. Then the sky turned a sickly shade of green, the color of old copper. The wind began to howl, and then it began to scream. A few people saw the funnel cloud descending from the black base of the storm, a twisting rope of vapor that seemed to reach down and touch the earth with a terrible purpose. The roar grew louder until it drowned out every other sound. It was a noise that survivors would later describe as the end of the world. The tornado struck the southwestern edge of town first. It tore through the farmlands, ripping trees out of the ground by their roots, lifting horses and cattle into the air as if they weighed nothing. It slammed into the first houses on the outskirts, splintering them into kindling. The winds were estimated to have exceeded 300 miles per hour. Wooden homes simply exploded. Brick buildings, which were supposed to be safe, crumbled like sandcastles against the tide. The tornado was not a single funnel but a massive, rotating column of debris, a dark wall of destruction that advanced at a speed that left no time to run. In the center of town, people did what they could. Some dove into cellars, others threw themselves under heavy furniture. A few tried to flee in wagons, but the horses were too terrified to move. The tornado hit Main Street with its full force at about 4:30. It ripped the roofs off the stores and tossed them into the air like paper. It picked up the train depot and carried it 100 yards before dropping it in a heap. The railroad tracks were torn from their ties and twisted into ribbons of steel. The Opera House, a grand building that had been the pride of the town, was lifted off its foundation and collapsed inward, killing scores of people who had sought shelter inside. The storm passed through in less than a minute. In that 60 seconds, it destroyed or damaged nearly every building in New Richmond. The population of 2,000 was reduced by 117 dead, with over 120 more injured. The numbers are staggering, but they do not capture the terror of those moments. They do not tell you about the mother who held her baby in her arms as the wall of their house blew away, only to have the child torn from her grasp by the wind. They do not tell you about the men who were lifted into the air and dropped miles away, broken and bleeding. They do not tell you about the silence that followed when the roar stopped and the only sound was the moaning of the wounded and the crying of the lost. One of the most heartbreaking stories from that day comes from the local school. The schoolhouse was a sturdy 2-story building, and at the time of the storm, nearly 100 children were inside. The teachers tried to get the students into the basement, but there was no time. The tornado hit the school directly. The building collapsed with the upper floor falling onto the lower floor. Many children were killed instantly. Others were pinned under the rubble, calling out for their parents. Rescuers worked through the night, pulling out the living and the dead. In the days that followed, the town held funerals for nearly 40 children. There was not enough lumber in the region to build coffins fast enough. They had to be shipped in by train. Another story that has been passed down through generations is that of the Congregational Church. The church was a beautiful wooden structure with a tall steeple that could be seen from miles away. As the tornado approached, the pastor and a handful of parishioners gathered inside, hoping to pray through the storm. The steeple was the first thing to go. It snapped off at the base and was carried away. The main building collapsed a moment later. The pastor survived, but he was buried under the debris for hours. When they pulled him out, he was covered in blood and dust, but he immediately began walking through the wreckage, offering comfort to the dying and blessing the dead. He lost his voice that day, but he never stopped whispering prayers. The aftermath of the tornado was a scene of utter desolation. Those who survived wandered through the ruins, dazed and weeping. The dead lay in the streets, covered only with sheets or coats. The injured were carried to makeshift hospitals set up in the few buildings that still had walls. The train station was gone, so the first word of the disaster had to be carried on foot to the nearest telegraph office in a neighboring town. Once the news got out, relief trains began arriving from St. Paul, Minneapolis, and other cities. They brought doctors, nurses, food, blankets, and coffins. The governor of Wisconsin declared a state of emergency and sent the state militia to help with the recovery. But even as the help arrived, the survivors faced a grim reality. They had to identify the dead, which was a terrible task. Many bodies were unrecognizable, crushed beyond recognition, or burned in the fires that broke out after the storm. The tornado had actually sparked fires by knocking over stoves and lamps, and these fires spread through the piles of debris, adding to the horror. The town was filled with the smell of smoke, dust, and death. One man, a farmer named John, was out in his field when the storm hit. He saw the funnel coming and threw himself into a ditch. The wind passed over him and he felt the suction pulling at his clothes, trying to lift him into the air. He held onto a fence post with all his strength. When it was over, he stood up and looked toward town. He could not see a single building standing. The entire landscape had been flattened. He walked for miles through the wreckage, searching for his wife and children. He found his wife alive, pinned under a fallen wall, but his children were dead, huddled together in the cellar of their home. He later said that he did not cry. He just sat down and stared at the sky, and he did not speak for 3 days. There were also stories of inexplicable survival. A young girl named Anna was at home with her grandmother when the storm hit. The grandmother pushed her into the cast-iron stove, the only heavy object in the room, and then lay on top of her. The house collapsed around them, but the stove protected the girl from the falling timbers. The grandmother was killed, but Anna survived with only bruises. She lived to be an old woman and told this story to her grandchildren every year on the anniversary of the tornado. As the sun set on June 12, 1899, the survivors of New Richmond gathered in the ruins of what had been their homes. They built campfires to cook what little food they could find and to keep the wild animals away from the bodies. They sang hymns, some of them broken and tearful. They prayed, they held each other, and in the darkness they began the slow, painful work of rebuilding their town and their lives. The tornado did not break their spirit. In the weeks and months that followed, New Richmond was rebuilt. A new school was built and new churches and new homes. But the memory of that day never faded. Every year on June 12th, the town holds a memorial service at the cemetery where so many of its children are buried. They read the names of the dead and they tell the stories, passing the memory from one generation to the next, so that what happened on that terrible Tuesday afternoon in 1899 will never be forgotten. The storm itself was part of a larger weather system that produced a series of deadly tornadoes across the Midwest that day, but none were as destructive as the one that hit New Richmond. Meteorologists have studied it for over a century, trying to understand why it was so violent. Modern science suggests that extreme instability in the atmosphere combined with strong wind shear created the perfect conditions for a monster tornado. But for the people of New Richmond, no explanation is needed. They know what they saw, they know what they felt. And they know that in the space of 1 minute, the world as they knew it was torn apart. The days after the tornado were a blur of grief and labor. The dead were buried in a mass grave at the New Richmond Cemetery, though many families later exhumed their loved ones and gave them individual headstones. The injured were treated in tents and temporary hospitals. The Red Cross, still a young organization at the time, sent aid. Clara Barton herself, the founder of the American Red Cross, was reported to have visited the site, though accounts differ. What is certain is that the nation rallied to help this small town in Wisconsin. As the weeks turned into months, the rebuilding began in earnest. The citizens of New Richmond did not abandon their town. They cleared the debris, salvaging whatever they could. They raised new buildings, stronger than the old ones. They planted new trees. They started over, but they never forgot. The tornado left a scar on the landscape and on the hearts of everyone who lived through it. That scar is still visible today, not in the physical town, which has grown and changed, but in the collective memory of its people. This is the story of the New Richmond Tornado of 1899. It is a story of sudden violence and profound loss. It is a story of ordinary people facing an extraordinary horror. And it is a story that we will continue to tell because some stories are too important to be forgotten. They remind us of the power of nature, the fragility of life, and the resilience of the human spirit. The opening segment of this podcast episode ends here, but the story is far from over. In the next chapter, we will explore the lives of the survivors, the heroes who emerged from the rubble, and the long road to recovery. We will hear more of their voices, their memories, and their hope. But for now, we sit with the silence that fell over New Richmond on that June evening, a silence broken only by the wind that still whispered through the ruins. The wind that whispered through the ruins that evening carried more than just dust and the scent of smoke. It carried the voices of the dead, or so the survivors would later say. In the weeks that followed, many of them could not sleep. Every creak of a floorboard, every gust against a window sent them diving for cover. They would lie awake in the makeshift shelters that had been erected in the town square, staring at the canvas above them, listening to the night sounds, and wondering if another monster was hiding in the clouds. The children who survived were the hardest to reach. Some of them had watched their brothers and sisters die beside them. Others had been plucked from the wreckage of their own homes only to find that their parents were gone. They sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide and empty. The relief workers tried to comfort them with candy and toys, but nothing could fill the void that the tornado had carved into their young hearts. One little boy, no more than 5 years old, refused to speak for 6 months. He would only point at things. His mother, who had lost her husband and 2 other children, would hold him and rock him and sing the old hymns, but he would not sing back. Eventually, he began to whisper the words, but he never again spoke loudly enough to be heard by anyone but her. The Red Cross set up a temporary hospital in the ruined shell of the Methodist Church, whose brick walls had somehow remained standing. The doctors worked by lantern light, amputating limbs that were crushed beyond saving, stitching wounds with thread from sewing kits, and administering morphine to those who could not bear the pain. They ran out of morphine on the second day. After that, they had to use whiskey and sheer willpower. One nurse, a young woman named Margaret from St. Paul, later wrote in her diary that she had never seen such suffering. She wrote about a man whose leg was pinned under a beam. The rescue workers could not lift the beam, so they had to saw through his leg to free him. He did not scream. He just bit down on a leather strap and stared at the sky until it was over. Then he whispered, "Thank you," and passed out. The railroad was the town's lifeline, and it became the focus of the initial recovery efforts. The tracks had been twisted into loops and spirals, as if a giant hand had wrung them out like wet cloth. Teams of men from the surrounding towns came with crowbars and sledgehammers to straighten the rails. They worked day and night, eating cold beans and drinking water from barrels. By the end of the first week, a single track was passable, and the first relief train rolled in. It was a steam locomotive pulling a long line of freight cars filled with supplies. The sound of the whistle carried across the flattened landscape, and people emerged from their tents and shelters to watch it approach. Some of them wept. Others cheered, but most just stood there, still too numb to feel anything but exhaustion. One of the most remarkable stories to come out of the recovery was that of the telegraph operator. His name was Edwin, and he had been in the telegraph office when the tornado struck. The office was a small wooden building near the depot, and it was completely destroyed. Edwin was buried under the debris, but his arm was free. He could hear the operator in the next town tapping out a signal, asking if anyone was alive. With his free hand, he managed to reach a piece of wire and some metal scraps. He rigged a makeshift key and sent a single message: "New Richmond wiped out, send help." The operator in the next town, a young man named Charles, did not believe it at first. He thought it was a prank, but the signal was weak and desperate, and something in its rhythm told him it was real. He sent the message up the line, and within hours, the governor was notified. Edwin was eventually pulled from the rubble, but his legs were crushed. He spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair, but he never stopped working. He became the town's postmaster, and he would tell the story of that day to anyone who would listen. He said that when he sent that first message, he was not thinking about himself. He was thinking about all the people who were still alive under the wreckage, waiting for someone to come. He said that he would have sent 1,000 messages if he had to, until the help arrived. The help did arrive in waves. First came the doctors and nurses from the cities. Then came the soldiers from the state militia, who set up tents and organized the search parties. Then came the journalists who wrote sensationalized accounts of the disaster for newspapers across the country. The survivors resented the journalists. They felt like vultures picking through their grief for a story. But the journalists also brought attention and donations, and without them, the town might not have received the funds it needed to rebuild. It was a strange and painful relationship, one that left a bitter taste in the mouths of many. As the days turned into weeks, the focus shifted from rescue to recovery. The dead had to be buried, and the mass grave at the cemetery was filling quickly. But many families refused to accept that their loved ones were gone. They kept searching even when there was no hope left. One mother, a woman named Hattie, searched for her daughter for 3 weeks. She had been told that the girl was dead, but she did not believe it. She walked through every pile of debris, lifting boards and peering into holes. She called her daughter's name until her voice was nothing but a whisper. Finally, she found a small shoe in the mud, and she knew. She carried that shoe with her for the rest of her life, wrapped in a handkerchief and kept in a drawer by her bed. The stories of the dead were just as poignant as the stories of the survivors. There was a young couple who had been married only a month. They were found together, their arms wrapped around each other, buried under the same beam. There was an elderly man who had been sitting on his porch when the tornado hit. He was carried half a mile and dropped in a field, still clutching his pipe. There was a baby who was found alive, unharmed, lying on a patch of grass that had been swept clean of everything else. No one knew who the baby belonged to. The mother was never identified, and the child was adopted by a family in Illinois. The tornado also took the lives of several prominent citizens, including the mayor and the editor of the local newspaper. The newspaper building was destroyed, and the printing press was smashed to pieces. The editor, a man named William, had been working on the next edition when the storm hit. His body was found near the press, still holding a pencil. The newspaper did not publish for 3 months after the tornado. When it finally returned, the first edition was a single page printed on a borrowed press. It listed the names of the dead, the injured, and the missing. It also contained a short editorial written by the new editor that said, "We will not forget, we will rebuild, we will endure." And they did endure. The rebuilding of New Richmond was a testament to the human spirit. The first new building to go up was a general store owned by a man named Samuel. He had lost his wife and 2 children in the tornado, but he did not give up. He borrowed money from relatives in Milwaukee and bought a load of lumber. He built the store with his own hands, working from dawn until dusk. When it was finished, he opened the doors and began selling goods to the other survivors. He gave credit to those who could not pay, and he never turned anyone away. His store became the heart of the new town, a place where people could gather and talk and find some sense of normalcy. The churches were rebuilt one by one. The Congregational Church, whose steeple had been carried away, was rebuilt with a shorter, sturdier steeple. The pastor who had survived and whispered prayers over the dead became a beloved figure in the community. He never regained his full voice, but he did not need it. His presence alone was enough to comfort the grieving. He would walk through the streets every day, nodding to people, laying a hand on their shoulders and offering a silent blessing. He died 10 years later, and the entire town turned out for his funeral. The school was rebuilt as well, but it was not the same. The new school was built of brick with heavy doors and reinforced windows. The classrooms were painted white and the desks were bolted to the floor. The teachers were instructed to conduct regular tornado drills, something that had never been done before. The children would practice crouching under their desks, covering their heads and staying quiet. They did these drills with a seriousness that was almost terrifying. They knew what could happen. They had seen it. As the years passed, the town slowly healed. New families moved in, drawn by the cheap land and the sense of community. The scars of the tornado began to fade, but they never disappeared entirely. There were always reminders. The empty lots where houses once stood. The old cemetery with its long rows of headstones, many of them bearing the same date. The stories that were told every June 12th at the memorial service. The children who grew up hearing those stories passed them on to their own children, and those children passed them on to theirs. The tornado became a part of the town's identity, a defining moment that shaped everything that came after. In the 1950s, a historian named Robert visited New Richmond to research the tornado. He interviewed dozens of survivors, many of whom were now elderly. He recorded their stories on a reel-to-reel tape recorder, capturing their voices and their memories. He later published a book, but the tapes themselves are perhaps the most valuable record. They contain the raw, unedited voices of the people who lived through it. You can hear the cracks in their voices, the pauses, the moments when they had to stop and compose themselves. You can hear the fear that still lingered even decades later. And you can hear the gratitude, the love for the community that had held them together. One of the tapes contains the voice of Anna, the girl who had been saved by the cast-iron stove. She was in her 70s when Robert interviewed her, and she spoke with a clear, steady voice. She described the tornado in vivid detail, the sound of the wind, the darkness, the weight of her grandmother's body on top of her. She said that she had never been afraid of storms after that. She said that she believed her grandmother had given her life, and she was determined to live it fully. She had married, had children, and become a teacher. She taught at the new school for 40 years. Every year on the anniversary of the tornado, she would tell her students the story. She would end by saying, "Remember, children, that storms come and go, but love stays forever." The tornado of 1899 was not the last disaster to strike New Richmond. There were floods, fires, and other storms over the years, but none of them left the same mark. The town has changed a great deal since then. It is a modern community now, with paved streets, shopping centers, and a population that has grown and diversified. But the old cemetery still stands and the memorial service still takes place every year. The names of the dead are still read aloud and the stories are still told. The wind still blows through the trees, carrying the whispers of a century past. The wind still blows through the trees, carrying the whispers of a century past, but the people of New Richmond never let those whispers fade into silence. They built a museum, a small building on the main street filled with artifacts from the tornado. There were twisted pieces of metal, fragments of glass, a child's doll that had been found a mile away, and the bell from the Congregational Church, dented but still intact. Visitors came from all over the state to see these relics, to touch the past and feel the weight of history. The museum curator, a woman named Evelyn whose grandmother had survived the storm, would tell the story to every visitor. She never tired of it. She said that as long as someone told the story, the dead were not truly gone. They lived on in the telling. The 50th anniversary of the tornado in 1949 was a solemn occasion. The town held a ceremony at the cemetery, and hundreds of people attended, many of them survivors who had returned for the day. The governor of Wisconsin came and gave a speech praising the resilience of the people of New Richmond. He presented a plaque that was mounted on a granite stone near the mass grave. The plaque read, "In memory of those who perished in the tornado of June 12, 1899. Their courage and sacrifice will never be forgotten." An elderly woman named Martha, who had lost her entire family in the storm, was asked to unveil the plaque. She was in her 80s then, frail and bent, but her voice was strong as she spoke a simple prayer. The crowd stood in silence as a choir sang Amazing Grace. The wind picked up as they sang, rustling the leaves of the oak trees that had been planted decades earlier. Some people felt a chill and others felt a strange sense of peace. It was as if the spirits of the dead had joined the ceremony, listening to their own names being remembered. The 75th anniversary in 1974 was a smaller affair, but no less meaningful. The local historical society organized a walking tour of the tornado path, following the route of destruction from the northwest edge of town to the southeast. A group of 20 people gathered on a warm June morning, led by a volunteer named Harold who had been a boy of 10 when the tornado hit. He showed them the spots where houses once stood, where the school had been, where the general store was rebuilt. He pointed to a large oak tree near the edge of town, its trunk scarred by a piece of flying debris that had lodged in the bark and remained there for decades. Harold told the story of how his father had carried his mother out of the wreckage of their home, how they had walked through the ruins holding hands, how they had found their dog alive under a pile of bricks. The dog, a terrier named Daisy, had lived another 10 years. Harold still had a photograph of Daisy, taken a year after the tornado, sitting on the porch of their new house. He carried the photograph in his wallet and showed it to the group with a tear in his eye. "That dog saved us," he said. "She kept us going when we wanted to give up." As the 20th century drew to a close, the story of the New Richmond tornado began to attract the attention of meteorologists and historians from around the country. They studied the storm's path, its intensity, the unusual shape of the funnel cloud that had been described by so many survivors. They compared it to other tornadoes of the era, the 1896 St. Louis tornado, the 1903 New Richmond tornado. Wait, that was the same one, of course, but they also looked at the 1925 tri-state tornado, the deadliest in American history. The New Richmond tornado was not the largest, but it was one of the most documented, thanks to the newspapers and the personal accounts that had been preserved. It became a case study in disaster response and community resilience. Students at the University of Wisconsin wrote papers about it. A doctoral candidate named Linda spent 3 years reading every diary, every letter, every newspaper article she could find. She published a book in 1997 titled The Wind That Changed Us, which became the definitive history of the event. In the book, she wrote about the social and economic impact of the tornado, how it had transformed New Richmond from a small agricultural town into a modern community. She argued that the tornado had actually made the town stronger, that the shared trauma had forged bonds that lasted for generations. But the bonds were not without their cracks. Not everyone who survived the tornado was able to heal. There were those who could not bear to stay in New Richmond. They packed their belongings and moved away, some to other parts of Wisconsin, some to other states entirely. They tried to start over, but the memory of that day haunted them. One man, a farmer named Jacob, moved to Minnesota and bought a new farm. He never spoke of the tornado to anyone, not even his wife. But his nightmares were so vivid that she would find him sitting up in bed, screaming. He would refuse to go into the basement during thunderstorms. He would stand on the porch and watch the sky, his fists clenched, his eyes wide. He lived to be 92, but he never regained his peace. His daughter later said that the tornado had stolen something from her father that could never be returned. It had taken his faith, his trust in the world. He lived the rest of his life waiting for the next disaster. And then there were those who stayed but could not move forward. They built new houses and started new businesses, but they lived in constant fear. Every storm, every rumble of thunder, every gust of wind sent them into a panic. They installed tornado shelters in their basements, stocked with candles, water, and canned food. They kept a battery-powered radio tuned to the weather station. They taught their children to be afraid, to listen for the sound of a train, to run for cover at the first sign of a dark cloud. The fear was passed down like a family heirloom, a burden that each generation had to carry. It was not until the 1960s and 1970s, when the science of tornado prediction improved, that some of that fear began to subside. The National Weather Service established a severe weather warning system, and meteorologists learned to track storms with radar. The people of New Richmond began to feel safer, though they never forgot the lesson of 1899. The turn of the millennium brought new attention to the disaster. In 1999, the 100th anniversary was celebrated with a week of events. There was a parade, a barbecue, a fireworks display, and a special memorial service at the cemetery. The service was broadcast on local television and radio, and 1,000 people attended, including descendants of survivors who had traveled from as far away as California and New York. The keynote speaker was a great-grandson of the town's founder, a man named Charles who had become a historian of the American Midwest. He spoke about the importance of remembering not just the tragedy but the courage that followed. He quoted from one of the letters written by a Red Cross volunteer in 1899, a woman who had written, "I have never seen such strength in the face of such loss. These people are not victims, they are victors." The crowd applauded, and then 100 white balloons were released into the sky, each one carrying the name of a victim. The balloons floated upward, drifting southward on the wind, and the people watched until they were tiny specks against the blue. It was a beautiful sight, but also a bittersweet one. For every balloon there was a story, a life cut short, a family forever changed. The Historical Society also produced a documentary that year, featuring interviews with the last living survivors. By that time, only 3 people remained who had been alive in 1899, and they were all over 100 years old. Their memories were fading, but they still remembered the sound of the wind. One of them, a woman named Gladys, who had been 4 years old at the time, remembered being carried through the air by the tornado. She said it was like being lifted by a giant hand, and she had landed in a pile of hay unharmed. She remembered her mother screaming her name and the relief when she answered. She remembered the silence after the storm and then the cries for help. She said that she had never been able to hear a train whistle without feeling a chill for the rest of her life. The documentary was shown at the local high school auditorium, and the audience sat in hushed silence. When it ended, there was a long moment of quiet before the applause began. It was not loud applause. It was respectful, almost reverent. The documentary was also uploaded to the internet, and it reached an audience far beyond New Richmond. Comments poured in from people all over the world, many of them sharing their own stories of surviving tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes. The disaster had become a touchstone for human resilience, a symbol of what people can overcome when they come together. The town of New Richmond received letters from Japan, from Australia, from South Africa, from Brazil, all expressing sympathy and admiration. Some of the letters contained donations, and the Historical Society used the money to refurbish the museum and create an online archive of the tornado's history. The archive included scanned copies of the original newspaper articles, photographs, maps, and the audio tapes of Robert's interviews. Anyone with an internet connection could now listen to the voices of the survivors, the cracks in their voices, the pauses, the moments when they had to stop and compose themselves. The stories were no longer confined to New Richmond. They belonged to the world. By the early 21st century, the tornado had become part of the town's identity in a way that was both a burden and a blessing. Every summer, the town held a festival called Tornado Days, which included a street fair, a carnival, and a 5K run. Some people criticized the festival for trivializing the tragedy, but most residents saw it as a celebration of survival, a way to turn a day of sorrow into a day of joy. The festival raised money for the museum and the local library, and it drew tourists who wanted to learn about the town's history. The proceeds also helped fund a community center that served as a shelter during severe weather. The center was equipped with a generator, a first aid station, and enough cots for 200 people. It was named the 1899 shelter, and it stood as a reminder that preparedness could save lives. But even as the town moved forward, the past remained present in unexpected ways. In 2015, a construction crew digging a foundation for a new house unearthed a cache of personal belongings buried by the tornado. There were dishes, a silver teaspoon, a leather Bible, a child's toy soldiers. The items were caked in mud, but they were remarkably well preserved. The crew immediately stopped work and called the Historical Society. The artifacts were carefully removed and taken to the museum, where they were cleaned and catalogued. The Bible was opened, and the inscription inside read, "To my dear Sarah on our wedding day, June 1st, 1898. It had belonged to a couple who had been married just a year before the tornado. The couple's names were Sarah and Thomas, and they had both died in the storm. Their descendants, a family living in Colorado, were tracked down and invited to see the Bible." The great-granddaughter of Sarah said that she had grown up hearing the story of her ancestors' tragic love, but she had never expected to hold something that had once been in their hands. She wept as she held the Bible, and she said that it felt like they were still alive in a way, that a part of them had been recovered from the earth. The discovery sparked a renewed interest in the tornado, and historians revisited the old archives with fresh eyes. They found letters that had been misfiled, photographs that had been mislabeled, and eyewitness accounts that had never been published. They pieced together a more complete picture of the disaster, identifying several additional victims who had originally been counted among the missing. The official death toll was revised upward from 117 to 123. The additional names were added to the memorial at the cemetery, and the town held a small ceremony to honor them. The new names were read aloud by a local schoolteacher, a woman whose own great-great-grandmother had been a survivor. The teacher said that the dead deserved to be remembered, even if it took over a century to find them. "Their story is our story," she said, "and we are bound to tell it." And so the stories continue to be told generation after generation. The children of New Richmond grow up knowing the date June 12, 1899 as surely as they know their own birthdays. They learn about the tornado in school, and they visit the museum on field trips. They read the letters and hear the tapes. They see the twisted metal and the shattered glass. They walk through the cemetery and read the tombstones, many of which bear the same date. Some of them feel a connection to the past that is almost tangible. Others feel a sense of relief that they live in a safer era with weather warnings and sturdy buildings. But all of them understand that the world can change in an instant, that the sky can turn black, and that the only thing we can truly hold on to is each other. The tornado of 1899 is not just a historical event. It is a living memory, a story that refuses to end. The wind that destroyed the town also planted the seeds of its rebirth. The people who suffered and mourned also loved and rebuilt. The town that was shattered also became a beacon of hope. And the voices of the dead still whisper through the trees, reminding the living that every day is a gift, that every moment is precious, and that even in the darkest storm there is light. The light of human courage, the light of community, the light of love. That light has never gone out in New Richmond. It still shines across the fields and the rivers and the years, carrying the story forward forever and ever. The years rolled on, and the town of New Richmond continued to evolve, but the tornado remained a constant presence, a thread woven into the fabric of everyday life. Newcomers to the town often remarked on how the old-timers would glance at the sky during a summer storm, their eyes scanning the horizon with a practiced wariness that seemed almost instinctual. It was not fear exactly, but a deep respect for the power of nature, a recognition that the earth and sky were not always kind. The children who grew up in the 21st century learned about the tornado in school, but they also learned about it from their grandparents, who had learned about it from their grandparents, and the story was passed down like a family heirloom, polished and cherished with each telling. One of the most remarkable aspects of the tornado's legacy was the way it had shaped the town's approach to disaster preparedness. In the years following the tragedy, New Richmond became a leader in weather safety, long before such concepts were common. The town had one of the first community-wide storm warning systems in the state, a network of sirens and telephone chains that could be activated within minutes. When the National Weather Service began issuing tornado watches and warnings in the 1950s, New Richmond was already ahead of the curve, with a system of volunteer spotters who would watch the skies during any severe weather. The town's experience had become a case study for meteorologists and emergency planners, and researchers from universities across the country came to study how a small community had turned a disaster into a blueprint for survival. The lessons of the New Richmond tornado were not just about technology or infrastructure. They were about human nature, about the way people react under extreme stress, about the bonds that form when everyone is in the same storm. In the 1990s, a book was published by a historian from the University of Wisconsin titled The Day the Sky Fell, The New Richmond Tornado of 1899. It was a comprehensive account, drawing on hundreds of interviews and thousands of documents. The book spent several weeks on the local bestseller list and was eventually picked up by a national publisher. It was praised for its vivid storytelling and its unflinching portrayal of both the horror and the heroism. The author, a woman named Eleanor Cross, had grown up in nearby Hudson and had heard stories of the tornado from her grandmother. She said that writing the book felt like a duty, a way to honor the dead and to ensure that their sacrifices were not forgotten. The book led to a renewed wave of interest, and the Historical Society began receiving requests from filmmakers and journalists. A documentary crew from the BBC came to New Richmond in 2002, filming interviews with the last survivors and capturing the town's annual memorial service. The documentary aired in the United Kingdom and was later shown on public television in the United States. It was titled The Wind That Changed the World, and it focused not just on the destruction but on the recovery, on the way the town rebuilt itself into something stronger and more resilient. The film ended with a shot of the memorial at the cemetery, the sun setting behind it, and the narrator said, "In the end, the tornado did not destroy New Richmond. It created it." That line resonated deeply with the people of the town. They had always felt that the tornado was a part of their identity, but they had never quite articulated it that way. The disaster had forced them to rebuild, and in rebuilding, they had created something new. The town that had been a quiet farming community in 1899 had become a model of community spirit and innovation. The tornado had wiped away the old and made room for the new, and while the cost had been unimaginable, the result was a town that knew the value of every moment, every neighbor, every breath. As the 21st century progressed, the population of New Richmond grew slowly but steadily. New families moved in, drawn by the affordable housing and the strong sense of community. They built homes on the same streets that had once been rubble, planted gardens on soil that had been soaked in blood, and raised children who would one day carry the story forward. The town's school system incorporated the tornado into the curriculum, teaching lessons about history, science, and civic responsibility. Students studied the weather patterns that had led to the storm, mapped the path of the tornado, and calculated the death toll and the property damage. They read firsthand accounts from the survivors and wrote their own reflections on what it meant to live in a place that had been reborn from tragedy. One student, a boy named Eli, wrote a poem for his 8th grade English class that was later published in the local newspaper. It ended with the lines, "The wind took everything we had, but the wind could not take our will. The sky turned black, the ground turned red, but the heart of New Richmond is beating still." The poem was read at the next memorial service, and as the words were spoken, the crowd nodded in recognition. They knew the truth of those lines, for they had inherited that will. It was in the way they helped their neighbors during a blizzard, the way they organized fundraisers for families in need, the way they refused to let the past define them but instead let it guide them. The tornado also had a lasting impact on the local economy. In the decades after the disaster, the town's businesses had been rebuilt with an emphasis on resilience and community support. The grain elevators and factories were constructed with reinforced walls and steel beams, and the downtown area was designed with wide streets and open spaces that could serve as evacuation zones. The town's farmers, whose ancestors had lost everything in 1899, still spoke of the tornado with a mixture of sorrow and pride. They knew that their fields were fertile because of the rains that had followed the storm, that the soil had been enriched by the debris, that the cycle of life and death continued even in the most unlikely ways. It was a difficult truth, but it was a truth they accepted. In the summer of 2024, a small group of historians and meteorologists gathered in New Richmond for a conference on severe weather and community resilience. They came from universities and research institutes across the country, and they spent 3 days presenting papers and discussing the latest findings. On the final day, they took a walking tour of the town, led by the director of the Historical Society. They visited the cemetery, the memorial, the museum, and the 1899 shelter. They stood at the spot where the opera house had once stood, where so many had died. They listened to the sound of the wind in the trees, and one of the meteorologists, a young woman named Dr. Chen, said that she had never felt history so alive. "This isn't just a data set," she said. "This is a story, and it's still being written." As the sun began to set, the group walked back to the town square, where a small crowd had gathered for an evening concert. It was part of the Tornado Days Festival, a tradition that had now endured for over a century. The concert was held on a temporary stage set up in front of the gazebo, and the band played a mix of folk songs and modern hits. People of all ages sat on blankets and lawn chairs, eating ice cream and chatting. The mood was light and joyful, a celebration of life and community. As the music played, a young girl, maybe 6 years old, tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed at the sky. There were clouds gathering in the west, dark and low, but they were not threatening. The mother looked up and smiled. "It's just rain," she said. "Nothing to worry about." The girl nodded, but she kept her eyes on the clouds for a long moment, as if she sensed that the sky could never be taken for granted. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy of the new Richmond tornado. It taught the people of that town and all who heard their story to respect the forces of nature but not to fear them, to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best, to hold each other close during the storm and to celebrate each other when the sun came out. The tornado of 1899 was a wound that had scarred the land and the people, but scars are proof that healing has taken place. The wound was deep, but it was not fatal. The town survived, the people survived, and their story, told and retold generation after generation, became a beacon for anyone who had faced a disaster and wondered if they could go on. The answer, as the people of New Richmond knew, was yes. You could go on, you could rebuild. You could find joy again, even in the shadow of tragedy. The wind could take your house, your possessions, your loved ones, but it could never take your spirit. That spirit lived on in every brick laid by a neighbor, every meal shared by a community, every child who learned to look at the sky with both wonder and caution. It lived on in the stories, the photographs, the letters, the voices that still echoed through time. And it would continue to live on as long as there were people willing to listen, to remember, and to tell the tale. And so the story of the New Richmond tornado does not end. It continues in every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every time a siren sounds and the people gather in the shelter, every time a child asks what happened here, and an elder answers with a voice full of memory. It continues in the gentle rustle of the leaves on a summer evening, in the distant rumble of thunder, in the quiet certainty that when the storm comes, we will face it together. That is the lesson of 1899, the gift of that terrible day. A gift that the people of New Richmond have unwrapped generation after generation, passing it forward to all who will receive it. And as the final notes of the concert fade into the night, and the stars emerge one by one above the town, the story remains alive and breathing, waiting for the next teller, the next listener, the next heart to be touched by the wind that changed the world. After the concert ended, the crowd began to disperse slowly, as if reluctant to let go of the evening's warmth. Dr. Chen lingered near the gazebo, her notebook still in hand, though she had stopped taking notes hours ago. The director of the Historical Society, a woman named Margaret who had been leading tour for over 30 years, walked over and stood beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. They watched the last of the festival-goers fold their chairs and gather their children, the laughter and chatter fading into the night. Margaret finally broke the silence. "You know, every year someone asks me if I ever get tired of telling the same story, and every year I tell them the same thing. I never tell the same story twice, because the story changes with each telling. It grows, it takes on new meaning as the world changes." She paused, looking up at the stars. "When I first started, the survivors were still alive. I could sit with them on their porches and hear the details from their own lips. Now those voices are gone, but the story isn't gone, it's just different." Dr. Chen nodded. "I understand, in meteorology we think of data as static, numbers, measurements, paths, but when you look at a historical event like this, the data only tells part of the story. The rest is how people interpret it, how they carry it forward." She closed her notebook. "I think that's why I came here. Not just to study the storm, but to understand what it means to live in its shadow." Margaret smiled. "Come back tomorrow morning, I'll show you something not every visitor gets to see." The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Dr. Chen met Margaret at the Historical Society. The town was quiet, save for a few early joggers and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Margaret led her not to the museum or the memorial, but to a small house on a side street, its porch lined with petunias. An elderly woman with silver hair sat on the porch, sipping coffee. Margaret introduced her as Alina, the granddaughter of a man who had lost his entire family in the tornado and then helped dig bodies out of the rubble for 3 days straight. Alina invited them inside. The house was modest but filled with photographs and newspaper clippings, many yellowed with age. She pointed to a framed picture on the wall, a young man in a suit standing in front of a grain elevator. "That's my grandfather, Thomas. He was 17 when the tornado hit. He lost his mother, his father, his 2 sisters, and his baby brother. He was the only one left." Alina's voice was steady, as if she had told this story many times. "He never talked about it much when I was a child. Only later, when I was grown, did he share a few things. He said the worst part wasn't the wind or the noise. It was the silence after, the sudden stillness when the storm passed, and the only sound was the crying of the injured and the moaning of the dying." She paused, taking a sip of her coffee. "But he also said that silence taught him something. It taught him that life is fragile, yes, but it also taught him that life is precious. He built a new family. He married, had children, became a community leader. He would say, "The tornado took everything I had, but it also gave me a reason to live every day like it mattered." Dr. Chen listened, her eyes fixed on the photograph. "He sounds like an incredible man." "He was," Alina said, "and he made sure we never forgot. He used to say, 'Remember the silence, but don't let it stop you from making noise.'" She laughed softly. "I think he meant that we should live fully, love deeply, and never take a single sunrise for granted." Margaret glanced at her watch. "We should let you get on with your day, Alina. Thank you for sharing." As they walked back to the town square, Dr. Chen felt a shift in her perspective. The tornado was no longer just an event from a textbook, a statistic with a death toll and a path length. It was a living presence carried in the memories of families like Alina's. It was a force that had shaped not just the landscape, but the very character of the people who called New Richmond home. She thought about her own research, about the models she built, and the warnings she helped issue. She realized that the most important part of her work was not the accuracy of the prediction, but the way that prediction was received, how it became part of a community's story. Later that day, during the final session of the conference, Dr. Chen stood at the podium and offered her closing remarks. She did not speak about wind shear or barometric pressure. Instead, she spoke about the human element. We often talk about resilience as a measure of how quickly a community bounces back. But resilience is not just about speed, it's about depth. It's about embedding the lessons of disaster into the fabric of daily life. New Richmond did not just rebuild its buildings, it rebuilt its sense of purpose, and that is something no computer model can capture. The audience applauded, and as she stepped down, Margaret caught her eye and gave a small nod. They both knew that the story would continue, that next year's festival would feature new faces and perhaps a new poem or song, and that the tornado of 1899 would remain a living part of the town's soul. As the conference attendees departed, Dr. Chen lingered one more evening. She walked alone to the cemetery where the memorial stood silhouetted against the orange sky. She read the names etched in stone, each one a life extinguished too soon. But she also noticed the fresh flowers placed at the base, the small American flags, the handwritten notes tucked into the crevices. A note from a child read, "Thank you for making our town strong." She stayed until the stars appeared, and then she walked back to her car. Before she drove away, she looked back at the town, its lights twinkling in the darkness. She thought of Thomas, the young man who had lost everything and then rebuilt everything. She thought of Alina, who carried his story with grace. She thought of the festival, the concert, the laughter, the tears. And she understood that the tornado had not just created New Richmond. It had created a way of being, a philosophy of survival that could inspire anyone who faced an impossible loss. The podcast host might pause here, letting the silence speak. Then, a final voiceover. The New Richmond Tornado of 1899 reminds us that the worst moments in history are not the end of the story. They are the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter written by the hands of those who refuse to give up, who turn grief into gratitude, and who build with each brick and each word a monument to the human spirit. The wind that took so much also gave a gift, the knowledge that when we stand together we can weather any storm. And that is a story worth telling over and over until the end of time.